visible once again by the digital gap, which can be witnessed in this current global pandemic.
Well, and I witnessed young people from 9 different countries coming together without knowing each other before, digitally, in a multicultural global youth faith event and empowering each other.
That's right. But I have seen many small businesses in the last year disappearing from the scene, while large companies with transcontinental digital omnipresence have significantly multiplied their profit in short period of time.
I have seen the LGBTIQ community and other minorities facing discrimination finding new and safer spaces by exploring the opportunities of the digital space.
Well, Christina, I think this is going to be a very interesting conference. We thank the World Council of Churches, the World Association of Christian Communication, Bread for the World, the Evangelical Church in Germany, the Association of Protestant Churches and Missions in Germany, and the World Student Christian Federation, Europe region, for organizing such a timely conference for us.
Dear participants, please feel free to ask questions and contribute comments into the chat. We are monitoring the chat box for questions and your comments. Please keep your microphones muted unless we call on you to speak. You can follow this session in English, French, German, or Spanish. If you need interpretation, click on the globe icon on Zoom's bottom menu bar and choose the language you wish to hear. I would like to pass the mic now to Reverend Professor Ioan Sauca, Acting General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, for a word of greeting, which has been pre-recorded.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers, present in Berlin or following elsewhere online. Please consider these situations. A young girl in Africa is enabled to learn and grow through the curricular resources newly available to her online. You buy something online. Redefining privacy, commercial enterprises there can now track not only your purchases and shopping habits, but also your location, interests, reading habits, and friendship networks. Women in Afghanistan, fearing new repressions, are able through social media to rapidly assemble a protest and to ensure that news of it reaches around the world. Radio and television stations in the USA dramatically augment their audiences through live streaming and podcasts, but also are able to skew their news and coverage to the perceived opinions and even biases of their audiences, stoking xenophobia and racism. A global fellowship is able to alert its members everywhere to the circumstances, challenges, and insights of churches in the Pacific Islands threatened by climate changes. These and thousands of other examples illustrate the life transformation we have all experienced, especially in the global North and West, over the last 20 or so years by virtue of digital mechanisms. The internet, news media, social media, and internet-based commerce have affected all aspects of our lives. The resulting radical high-speed change in the way we live and work have even raised questions about what it means to be human. Digital communication increasingly calls for deeper reflection and new thinking in philosophy, ethics, jurisprudence, and theology. That is why I'm so pleased, on behalf of the World Council of Churches, and with our co-sponsors from the World Association of Christian Communicators, Brot für die Welt, Evangelical Church in Germany, EKD, Evangelische Mission Weltweit, EMW, and World Student Christian Federation, to greet you during this 3-day symposium and public dialogue on how best to understand, evaluate, and re-envision digital communication in light of social justice. In this pandemic, we at the WCC have had to reinvent our communications and even our programmatic work, chiefly through digital innovation, to continue to stay in touch with our constituencies and to nurture and nourish the spirituality and ecclesial lives of our fellowship. Yet, that is just a foretaste of the momentous and in some respects troubling ascendancy of digital media. At one level, there emerge inequitable access to digital media and to the benefits they bestow. Further concerns arise from the marginalization and dismissals that groups and communities experience because they lack the means for effective digital communication. We miss their voices, their stories, their insights. More broadly, we see that digital media not only enhance but also threaten our personal lives as consumers, citizens, and families. Even further, public media is controlled by corporate interests and exploitation by demagogic forces in society have clouded the prospects for democracy and even truth itself around the world. Concerns such as this demonstrate that your experience and expertise are needed to grasp in its outlines and effects the revolution that has engulfed our world, transforming commerce and public media, but also what we mean by friendship, community, and intimacy. The program in which you are participating promises to raise and tackle this whole range of issues in an objective and inclusive manner. And I look forward to reading the results of your reflections and seeing how they might enhance our work in the WCC and the prospects for digital justice in the world. May the Church continue to be a beacon of transformation, reflecting the peace and justice of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, amidst the global reality of a raging pandemic, as well as the long continued pandemics of inequity and injustice and extensive ecological and economic devastation. Let our fellowship and action reflect God's hope and love.
Thanks to Ioan Sauca for his words. The second opening greeting is offered to us by Pastor Dr. Dagmar Pruin, the president of Bread for the World. Dagmar speaks live to us here in the conference room of Bread for the World in Berlin. Welcome, Dagmar.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here and to greet you all. And I welcome you to the start of our symposium, Communication for Social Justice in a Digital Age. It's a great honor and a great pleasure that we have been successful to have this important and ecumenical event on the road to Karlsruhe in the run-up to the upcoming Assembly of the World Council of Churches, together with the WCC, the Evangelical Church in Germany, the Association of Protestant Churches and Missions in Germany, and the World Student Christian Federation. This is not a matter of course in the time of the COVID pandemic. We dearly would have loved to invite you all here in Berlin and have a meeting in person. Unfortunately, this is still not possible. That's why we use the digital space to meet and exchange ideas. And it is precisely this topic of digitalization and its various facets that are the subject of the conference. And this is interesting and this is comforting, but we still would have loved to have you here. Together with our partners, we at Brot für die Welt are committed to fair digitalization worldwide. So far, so many people in the global south have hardly been able to benefit from the digital transformation. That's why we at Brot for the World are committed to ensure that all people can take full advantage of the opportunity digitalization offers for social and political participation. Learning the necessary skills and functioning infrastructure are the basics condition. But digitalization must also be fair, sustainable, climate neutral, and respect human rights. Together with our worldwide partner organizations, we are currently developing project approaches for development cooperation and for the role of civil society in the digitalized world that offer ethical orientation and promote digital participation. This ecumenical symposium is an important platform for international exchange and strengthens the network of civil societies, including the churches. It makes us aware that the transformation of society through the digitalization is not only imminent, but that we are in the midst of it. Moreover, it enables us to demand social justice for all people with a clear voice and our own position. I want to thank everybody who made this symposium possible, and I know there is a lot of work going in a digital format like this, so thank you very much, everybody. My special thanks goes to the WACC and the WCC, who took the idea and initiative for this exchange very early on and made this symposium become real. And I wish us and you all, may it be at home or here in the room, a successful symposium, and I'm looking forward to exciting contributions and a lively exchange. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dagmar Pruin, for this warm welcome. Our next speaker is one of the presidents of the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Germany. As president of the foundation, she is responsible for the foundation's domestic policy department, for foreign and security policy, and for the European Union and North American department. In addition, she is in charge of the scholarship department, the Green Academy, a think tank of scholars and politicians, as well as the research archive Grünes Gedächtnis, or Green Memory Archive. What makes her feel relevant? As a teenager, growing up in the former East Germany, she defied all odds to illegally procure for herself secretly her communication rights. Here to discuss communication for social justice in a digital era, ladies and gentlemen, please let's welcome Dr. Ellen Ueberschär.
Thank you very much for this very warm welcome. Perhaps there is one point to add in my biography, that I've been the General Secretary of the German Protestant Kirchentag for 11 years. So I'm very familiar with WCC and also with WACC, and I'm very thankful and grateful that I have the chance to make a keynote on your topic today. Yeah, dear participants, as far as I understand, from all over the world, so I'm delighted to be with you and to share my thoughts on communication for social justice in a digital age. When did you discover your communication rights? Your right to get transparent and trustworthy information. Your right to read the texts that are meaningful to you and to share your own thoughts with others or to make them public. I can tell you when I discovered my communication rights. By the age of 16, roundabout, I had learned to touch type at high speed. Typewriters were worth their weight in gold in East Germany during the 80s. The Iron Curtain was still in place, and information access, distribution, let alone the freedom of speech, was not in place. So it was completely restricted by censorship. But I typed with a vengeance, copying books and magazines that had been smuggled into the East. Books by Dorothee Sölle, books about the Stalin era, books written by dissidents. My parish taught me the freedom of speech. It was the only space of open-mindedness. So I illegally took the communication rights that have been denied to me. Today, as was mentioned, I work for Heinrich Böll Foundation, which has more than 30 offices around the world. The foundation focuses on supporting and working with people in their struggle for freedom and for rights. Political lobbying for those whose rights are being violated and whose voices have been silenced is a key part of our mission. It is remarkable that within WACC, communication was defined very early as a human right. Radical ideas whose actual implementation and enforcement, as I see it, is yet to be realized, but which will be of a central importance in the dawning age of digital communication in the 21st century. We must note already here that the relationship between freedom of religion and communication rights is by no means easy. And that it also requires debate and conviction within the Christian spectrum. My vantage point today is a political one. What are the most pressing issues in the digital world regarding social rights and human dignity at the moment? During the pandemic, we all learned to appreciate the advantages of digital communication. We even celebrated Easter services online. We stayed in touch with our beloved ones via Zoom or Skype, and some of us were able to do their work completely online. And home office, for sure, will stay as a natural part of our professional life. The traffic in the air and on the streets dropped down, so there was even some relief for the climate. But at the same time, we saw governments using the pandemic to install new surveillance apps to pretending to combat the pandemic. The World Health Organization spoke of an infodemic, ubiquitous disinformation and fake news, massively amplified by social media and by the access of so many people to any information and disinformation. We saw digital companies that raced like a rocket to the top of the financial indices, whereas democracy indices marked a decline in media independence and ability to function. The broad-scale attack on the media as an independent actor and provider of information critical to the functioning of any democracy is intensifying. This ambiguity generally accompanies our views to the digital sphere, not only when it comes to mis- and disinformation. However, the less educated, the vulnerable groups, people in rural areas, are much more exposed to this kind of infodemic, of manipulated media than others. Their communication rights, which include access to a variety and truthfulness of information, are violated. This leads to my most important thesis: not only social coherence, but human dignity itself is at stake if we do not take up the fight for freedom and dignity in the digital sphere and scale it up to our offline efforts. The technical access to digital communication might be still a factor, but there is more. We must succeed in establishing ground rules for communication in the digital public sphere that enable minorities and vulnerable groups to exchange views and make themselves heard. The same goes for mechanisms to counter fake news and prioritize true empathy over quick emotions, and a culture of indignation that quickly descends into violence. The forces of democracy and public welfare must stand together in the fight to build credibility and trust in the digital media world. Digital participation is not a luxury or merely nice to have, but a prerequisite for the development of inclusive societies. Free access to information, unhindered opportunities to disseminate it, form the backbone of a democratic, open and prosperous society. In most democratic constitutions, freedom and civil rights are protected. At the same time, the legal awareness that these rights must also apply in the digital sphere is not very pronounced. Indeed, it is sometimes completely lacking and has not reached people's minds yet. Hence, second point, the digital rights themselves have to be fought for. And what is new in the digital sphere, the awareness for communication rights in the digital space has to be raised. And churches can contribute a lot. To open this conference, I would like to mark 3 major challenges and conclude with some ideas for necessary steps towards a just digitalization. The first challenge is surveillance and humiliating control versus informational self-determination and dignity. The American scientist Shoshana Zuboff has presented a sociological analysis of the digital era which has become an epoch-defining international bestseller, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Some experts and activists have urged us to read it as an act of digital self-defense. Zuboff describes how global tech companies such as Google and Facebook persuaded us to give up our privacy for the sake of convenience, how personal data has been used by others not only to predict our behavior, but also to influence and modify it, and how this has disastrous consequences for democracy and freedom. Zuboff defines it as expropriation of critical human rights. The data streams are being used more and more for surveillance and control. Think of dating apps where it is possible to swipe people away, human beings, to swipe them away with only one finger. Think of health apps where sensitive health data is delivered freely to companies and they may sell them to health insurance companies. Do you always know why and when a contact and information is visible for you on Facebook and others are not? Have you ever asked yourself what kind of knowledge about your personal life or the life of your community Facebook has collected? And have you ever asked Facebook to delete them? Most of us don't do things like that. And so the companies become more and more intrusive. From the past, we know how censorship is working, but we know less about manipulation of our emotions and our behavior. Zuboff, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism is a titanic struggle between capital and each one of us. It is a direct intervention into free will, an assault on human autonomy. Meanwhile, non-democratic governments, not only China, have learned their lessons. Non-democratic regimes have increasingly moved beyond merely suppressing online discourse and are shifting to proactively subverting and co-opting social media for their own purposes. Namely, social media is increasingly being used to undermine opposition, to shape the contours of the public debate, and to cheaply gather information about falsified public preferences. Regimes have frequently mobilized their supporters to shape the content of online conversations. Such assistance is particularly important in hybrid regimes like Russia, but others as well, which do not engage in the direct blocking of websites and focus not on denying access, that was the past, but on successfully competing with potential threats through effective counter-information campaigns that overwhelm, discredit, or demoralize opponents. These include techniques like mobilizing regime supporters to disrupt planned rallies, plant false information, monitor opposition websites, and harass opposition members. Allegation of web brigades in which Russian commenters, for instance, were paid to post pro-regime comments and discredit the opposition first appeared a decade ago. These organized groups were alleged to frequent popular pro-democracy forums to shape the public consciousness. We have to bear that in mind. Social media is no safe space for human rights and environmental activists. Let's take a look at a recent example, Afghanistan. Services like WhatsApp have been helpful to evacuating Afghans, but they can also make those individuals identifiable targets. The Taliban's own presence on social media also raises questions about the platform's obligations. The Taliban established a Twitter presence in 2011 and has maintained WhatsApp and Telegram accounts since 2015. Since then, these groups have been waging a propaganda appealing to far-right groups around the world. In theory, the Taliban are not very welcomed on these platforms. They were classified as a dangerous organization by both Facebook and YouTube some time ago. Twitter, on the other hand, has not imposed any blanket ban on the group. In practice, banning Taliban content is not that simple. The rapid evolution of government social media strategies has critical consequences, not only for the future of electoral democracy and state-society relations, but affects generally the trust in information and communication. Despite of that, let's be hopeful. There is more and more consensus on the urgency of regulating intermediaries with regard to the democratic public sphere and their influence on opinion-forming processes in the society. There is open debate about regulatory framework comparable to media legislation. Such a framework would automatically have repercussions on the fundamental rights of users. Second challenge, discrimination versus equality and social justice, fairness and participation. Another prerequisite of democracy is equality. In a diverse society, equal treatment must be fought for again and again, and for every characteristic of possible discrimination or against privilege, from education to the job market or for the search of housing. Equality means equal, fear-free participation and access to public goods, spaces, and networks. However, the business model of algorithm-based selection processes does not imply the principle of equality, but rather the worldview of the coders and the data of the past. Moreover, algorithm-based processes does not imply the principle. They are trained according to subjective criteria, which are usually non-transparent. This holds significant potential for discriminating against entire populations based on individual characteristics, whether in application processes, in allocation of school places, the assessment of creditworthiness, or in legal decisions, as at least in the US judicial system. Another example is facial recognition systems used in some countries. They often cannot correctly identify the faces of Black and Indigenous and other people, especially women of color. But some are used in law enforcement, prosecution, or prevention. This is a big problem and a big challenge. The third challenge, but I think, let me add this point. I think this point of discriminatory processes in algorithms is already being tackled in the civil society that is fighting for digital rights. That's why I didn't explain this in extent. But let me make the last change to the third challenge: hate speech and digital violence versus media freedom. The algorithms of intermediaries such as Facebook and Twitter multiply hate speech and ensure the rapid spread of disinformation. This disparagement of serious media and science, the creation of impenetrable information bubbles, distort the opinion-forming process, damage the democratic public sphere, and have also been proved to incite physical violence. During the corona pandemic, the already mentioned infodemic out of disinformation, conspiracy theories, and hostility to science appears life-threatening because scientifically verified information to protect health no longer reaches certain segments of the population. Depending on the strength of the public media, these are different-sized groups of people in different countries. When it comes to hate speech, on the one hand, there are perpetrators who claim freedom of expression for themselves, and on the other hand, we see and we have the victims who suffer intimidation and bullying, whose personal privacy is no longer protected, which prevents them from freely developing their personalities. A whole series of scientific studies prove the endangering effects, including self-censorship and psychological consequential damage for those affected, changes in implicit attitudes and opinions of the uninvolved and involved users. Women in particular are more likely than average to be victims of hate speech and digital violence. Until today, hate speech cannot prosecute it adequately unless it explicitly calls for violence against the individual. This way, most hate speech remains undetected and unpunished. While hate speech happens on globally used platforms, victims and perpetrators can only be prosecuted or protected by national laws. So these are the three challenges. What is necessary? The forces of democracy and public welfare must stand together in the fight to build credibility and trust in the digital media world. Digital participation is not a luxury or merely nice to have, but a prerequisite for the development of inclusive societies. Free access to information, unhindered opportunities to disseminate it, form the backbone of democracy, of openness, and prosperous societies. Civil society, churches of course included, have to be involved in finding what it means to have privacy, self-determination, security, and ensure equality and justice in the digital space. Some important requirements for political regulation are the following. We need global regulation to restrict the influence of internet platforms. The European Union has initiated such laws with the Digital Service Act and the Digital Markets Act. We need data protection like GDPR in the EU on a global scale. We need global regulation and ethical standards and norms. Alliances across the Atlantic are necessary. The rights now include a code of practice on disinformation among digital platforms. Data protection, just to mention, is not about protecting data. Data protection is about protecting human life and dignity. We need controlling mechanisms for the export of surveillance software that might be used for mass surveillance in authoritarian countries. We need alliances of tech democracies to join resources on critical digital infrastructure that might be more independent. We need, in German we would say, Pluralismuspflicht, an obligation to secure pluralism on all big social media networks to ensure an equal and just space to hear and to be heard. We need transparency of algorithms and micro-targeting measures. Another important and major topic is digital education, and this might be an important point for the churches. With educational offerings, a new awareness of defensive rights must be developed in schools, in associations, through political foundations and civil society, not only against the state, but also against private data collectors and users. Political education includes giving people the tools to use the internet in both directions. On the one hand, knowledge of one's own rights in the digital space must be strengthened, because awareness of rights violations and knowledge of dangers protect civil liberties. On the other hand, political education also includes the know-how to use the internet more and better for one's own benefit. Because it is only with these skills that digital education becomes an instrument for digital participation. Of course, this includes many more aspects, because of or inadequate internet access has a very concrete impact on children's educational opportunities, when opportunities for digital learning simply cannot be used due to a lack of stable access to the internet. The fundamental right to the free development of the personality is violated here from the outset. Another essential factor is the participation of citizens in political decision-making. This includes a broad public debate about security and freedom on the internet, about personal privacy, freedom of expression, and much more. These debates, as conflictual as they may be, raise awareness of individual fundamental rights in the digitalized world. It has been proven that sustained and meaningful political participation strengthens democracy. The more transparently and participatory politicians and administrators deal with the data they collect, with political responses to safeguard fundamental rights online, with the increase in communication and networking, and with the diverse information options, the more they strengthen the sovereignty of their citizens. Fundamental rights will not prevail on their own or through voluntary commitments by corporations. That is why the broad support and joint commitment of civil society and churches, included politics, science, business, is needed to guarantee and to protect civil rights in the digital age as well, to make the digital space usable for the common good. Thank you for your patience and your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ellen Ueberschär, for this profound and rich presentation. I would like to restate again the two main theses of your presentation. Thesis number one, not only social coherence, but human dignity itself is at stake if we do not take up the fight for freedom and dignity in the digital sphere and scale it up to our offline efforts. Thesis number two, The digital rights themselves have to be fought for. And what is new in the digital sphere is the awareness for communication on rights in the digital space has to be raised, and churches can contribute a lot to that. Thank you. The participants all over the world are engaging or would like to engage with you with some of the questions that they have. And the first question goes as follows. The urgency of regulations is obvious, but what is done so far in Europe and in other countries? That is the first question. I think we would like to answer that, and then we continue with the next one. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's an important question. As far as I can see, the European Union is at the moment on a good track to regulate not only the digital companies, but also the hate speech and mis- and disinformation problem. You see, this has to be globalized because the companies mainly have their headquarters in the US or in China and not in Europe. So it's not so easy to regulate this in Europe, but the European Union tries to do. With these there are big legislation pacts on their way, Digital Service Act especially, and Digital Market Act, to say, okay, we need a competition also in the digital sphere. So, for instance, it should be possible to bring your data, let's say, from WhatsApp to Signal or to another app. Not to that it's not possible for the companies, for Facebook, for instance, to collect the data and not to share. The important point is, are the companies prepared to share the data and to be accountable? What kind of data do they collect? And this is already, in Europe, it is already possible that you can say, okay, I refuse these kind of cookies and intrusive algorithms that try to influence my behavior and my decisions. Facebook, I want you to delete them. This is already possible. But as I said, and that's the main point I would like to make, less people are aware of these rights they already have in the European Union. Yeah? And that's the point. You have to take up your rights and not to think, oh, it's so convenient to put all my data on the internet and then it goes all along and I only have to click and buy. No, that's the problem. You are manipulated, and over time we will see how many data Facebook and other companies have already collected about myself, and then the credit is much more expensive. I don't get a health insurance, and I'm surveyed all around. So this is really my point. Be aware of the rights you already have.
Thank you so much. Here comes the second question. We often hear that the possible legal frameworks are too slow to really monitor internet communications, that is fake news, hate speech, etc., and communications steered by algorithms. What could be the role and political demands of civil society organizations in that fight?
Yeah, that's also a very important point. Sometimes I think legislation is, on the one hand side, an important topic, but how to regulate conversation on the internet. We all have to contribute and to say the truth and to say, okay, this is a lie, for instance, and churches really could contribute, and Christians could contribute, because they are connected to truthfulness and to information that is really that is proved by science, for instance, as far as the pandemic or health topics are involved. So I would really recommend to support women, to support activists who try to talk on the internet. I mean, Ioan Sauca, in the beginning, in his word, he talked about women and people who raise their voices and who can be sure that this is heard all over the world. So we really have to make sure that this is not only a matter of hearing, but also a matter of supporting them. So we have the opportunity to connect one another over the context. Sometimes I think it's too much to get in all the information from all over the world, but I think it is important, and this is the chance we should take, and we should really counter information, yeah? Spread the net with counter information, with facts, with truth, and with support. This is one communities really can organize themselves worldwide with supporting, with clicks and other posts to strengthen activists and the civil rights movements.
Thank you. This is another follow-up question to civil rights organizations. How can civil society organizations best build alliances and coalitions to build credibility and trust in the digital media world?
I think the first thing might be to meet personally, to organize encounters. This sounds kind of absurd because we speak about the digital age, but still it is important to meet each other, to organize conferences and to organize face-to-face meetings in order to get to know each other. And on that basis, a fight on the in the digital world is possible, and it's more effective. So that, for instance, with the Heinrich Böll Foundation is what we try to do. We try to connect people around the world to bring them together in summer schools or in certain regions where it is easier, much easier to meet. And then the people act themselves. It's not, digital communication it's not from one to many and there's the information and please spread it, but it's many to many. So the more you meet and the more you trust another person, the more you know, okay, she's spreading the right information, she's strengthening our network. And that is how we get successful in human rights topics and others.
Thank you very much. This leads to the next question then about meeting each other. What is necessary for better interaction between initiatives in the transnational digital world and the national legislations? What is necessary for better interaction between initiatives in the transnational digital world and the national legislations?
Okay, I only can repeat what I said. It is important to develop a strategy and to see who is there, because the good thing about the digital communication is that everyone has access, and especially what vulnerable people who are not heard. And I would say it's important to strengthen the networks and the groups, but then to bring the movement into the institutions. As long as institutions in any state, let's take the parliament or the courts, is disrupted by corruption or any other negative developments, then you won't be successful. But because in the end, if we want to that democracies get it back on the rising track and not, as we see it now, declining more and more, we do need trustful institutions. And I think that any movement, may it be in these half autocratic regimes, let's take Hungary. Next week I go to, or this week even, I go to Budapest to support the democratic mayor there and to say, okay, around the world, we really support what you're doing. We really support democratic development. We support that you have an open data strategy. We support that that you try to overcome the autocratic and the so-called liberal democratic style that was established by Viktor Orban. So this is always a mixture, and I think this applies to other contexts in Asia or in Africa as well. This is always a mixture between building up the civil rights movement on the one hand side and bring the engagement and the topics into the institutions.
Thank you. I would like to remind our viewers that we can engage the speaker in our chat conversations. So your questions are welcome. Now there is a shift to Christian organizations, and the question goes as follows. What is the special role of ecumenical and faith organizations in this fight or in this struggle?
I think the ecumenical organization and faith-based organization have a big advantage because they know in what terms and on what ground they are connected. So this is the faith, the common believing. And this is a basis of working together, which is already there, even if you haven't met yet. And so I think it's, and we are, of course, Christians are passionate for the truth, passionate for love, and all the things that include the common good. So there is a very good basis, and on that basis, each of us and around the world should think, okay, how can we contribute, and how can we bring things we do in the real so-called or in the offline world, we try to make happen. How can we connect in the digital world? And for instance, a meeting like the WCC assembly. I was part of the Busan assembly in 2013, and I wish I had more internet accounts and addresses from more people I met, and I really appreciate it. So I would have more connections. And I think this is an important point of this year's assembly, that you try to foster the network which is already there and which is already working in a way to mirror it in the digital sphere. This is a big possibility, but I really want to stress that the face-to-face encountering is so important to be successful in the digital era. So take up the chance of the WCC assembly this year in encountering and in having a trustful and trustworthy network.
Dr. Ueberschär, You mentioned discriminatory processes of women, of BIPOC people in digital knowledge and algorithms. What do you think are the reasons, and how can they meet the fight, or how can we meet the fight against these discriminations?
Yeah, the first point is to raise awareness about the fact that algorithms are discriminatory. So, I mean, from a technical point of view, algorithms, discrimination is the principle of work of algorithms. Algorithms try to discriminate this topic from another topic, and it's all about nil and one, And so it's a discrimination between nil and one. So this is the first discrimination, and it goes further and further. But now we talk about discrimination in a political or in a human and societal way, yeah? Which comes in because the coders and the one who write the algorithms have an idea of how the society works or how insurance works. So they have some data. I mean, take the US, you see, okay, many more, the number of colored people who have been who were in prison or so is very big. So if you are colored, it is very likely, from the statistics, it's very likely that you're not credit worthy because maybe you go to prison during the next 2 or 3 years. Yeah, it's kind of it's kind of prospective thinking, and the coders implement this kind of statistical information into the algorithm, and so the algorithm is discriminating us. What can we do about it? The first thing is to say, okay, people, we want to see what is your source code. We want you, company, that you're accountable, that we can see what have you programmed, and is this in line with our principles in the democracy. So this is the first. There are courses and schools that try to bring ethical education to coders, where universities and so on, where people who are fit in information science are being educated. This is an important point, that these people get aware of this. But the other point is to blame the companies and to say you have to stop this kind of programming. So they have to care for the algorithms that are in place. And this is one hand side, and the other is to bring this to the court, because discrimination is not legal. So you have to make legal cases in order to raise awareness and to, in the end, to reach something better. This will be a process, and I think over time we will succeed. But we don't have to be, or we don't have to get used to it. Yeah, that we say, okay, the algorithm is discriminating, so what? So yeah, and that's why the point, awareness of our rights, is very important in the digital sphere. If there is an offline place where you have no access, or think of South Africa and the apartheid, yeah, but certain areas are not for people with certain skin colors. That's not legal, and that's a violation of rights. And this happens in the digital sphere. And this is the same like the apartheid in South Africa. And with the same means, we combated apartheid. We have to combat the discrimination in the digital sphere.
We are talking about the digital age. But what about the vast majority of people who are left behind, who do not have access at all? Will they in the future, or will there be in the future, a world divided by digital waves? And by digital halves and the digital non-halves?
Is this not a good task for WCC and the churches to think about the access to the internet, to raise means in order to strengthen and to see? I mean, we still have, and we have a rising hunger in the world. That's a problem we are facing. We thought we've gone further in terms of the basic needs, but we haven't. But on the other hand, the complexity is rising because we see that people need necessary and basic goods on the one hand, and they need basic digital goods. This comes not on top because more and more digital access is as important as access to food or so. I really, we are in this conference and you are all called to contribute. Perhaps this, I think it's necessary to think of access to the digital means and to the internet as we think of access to food. So this is a basic need as well. And I'm not, I can't speak for all contexts, but I would like to bring this question into the conference to think about the digital access and building capabilities on the internet as a basic need.
Another participant would like to know how we can develop a better sensitivity for missing voices in the digital sphere.
Yes, this is also a question of how present we are. I mean, digital communication doesn't work, as I said, over or via an institution that gives them information, but each and everyone, and there are people who are really good in collecting attention from others, and I think this could also be a way to raise awareness for the common good, that each and every one of us tries to interfere in the digital public discourse and in different contexts, and to have an exchange about that.
Thank you, Dr. Ueberschär. You were highlighting the importance of face-to-face meetings. This could be understood as if digital encounter, also face-to-face, is less worthy or inferior. But on the other hand, there is so much evidence that digital encounters are real and meaningful to people. Is there an intergenerational gap, maybe, in this characterization?
Yeah, I think we should not say, okay, this is the only way, because the pandemic has taught us that we have these two ways. We can meet digitally as we can meet personally, and the two things belong together. Of course, I mean, the so-called digital natives, the generation that was born after 1980, are more fluent, and it's more, let's say, native or natural. It's more natural to them to communicate in the digital sphere. But at the same time, during the pandemic, you could observe that especially the young people were really in need of personal encountering. So they met illegally in parks, in the dark, and so because their need to meet face by face is so important. And you could not say the one is good and the other, or one is meaningful and the other isn't. It belongs together, and this will be the future, to have both, to have the personal meeting and to have the digital meeting.
Thank you. One of the last questions. How difficult do you think it is for the church to balance the advocacy for the digital rights while staying within the realms of the law?
Yeah, that's very important. Even in Europe, we lack movements that are that speak out for digital rights. The civil society in the for the digital sphere isn't as big as, for instance, the environmental one is. We do have, let's take Germany. We do have environmental organizations that have a say when it comes to legislation on environmental or climate issues or so. We don't have a similar development yet on the in the digital sphere. We do have some movements and organizations, but not enough. And we have less globally and worldwide. I mean, we do have Privacy Now and others based in Great Britain, other organizations that operate globally to foster fundamental rights, but that is not enough yet. I really would encourage all of you to see where are people who fight for the civil rights in the digital sphere, and how can we support them and bring in our ecumenical networks and the people we know. We really need the fostering, massive fostering of watchdog organizations in the digital sphere.
Dr. Ellen Ueberschär, we thank you very much for this insightful and profound presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dear participants, we are having our first break now. It is a 15 minutes break, and we will be back here at exactly 11:30 Berlin time. Thank you so much, and see you again in 15 minutes time. Thank you.
Dear participants, welcome back from the break. We start our next conversation with a small animation video, a teaser on our focus on social justice in a digital time.
Communication is so essential. We often take it for granted. And in the digital age, we seem to have more communication than ever. Of course, digital communication has clear benefits. But digital communication also has expected and unexpected challenges. The same platforms people use for news and connections are used to spread disinformation and hate. They can be used for surveillance and censorship. Our personal data generates huge profits for a few private tech companies, drawing needed funds away from public interest media. What we see online affects how we participate in our community and society. Culturally, politically, and economically. And a still gaping digital divide means hundreds of millions of marginalized people are falling still further behind. This is what we mean by digital justice. All of us need to understand what's at stake and take action to guarantee communication that embodies respect for the dignity, integrity, equality, and freedom of all human beings and their communities.
Our second keynote presentation today is offered to us by Bishop Heinrich Bedford-Strohm, Bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Bavaria and Chair of the Council of the Evangelical Church in Germany. He served as a parish minister, a professor for systematic theology, and as a church leader for many years. Now, Heinrich, I pass over the mic to you. We are very curious what you can tell us about social justice in digitalization.
Well, thank you, Christina. Dear sisters and brothers, I first want to praise the WCC for bringing us together to this digital conference. We all feel the mighty vehemence with which digitization has changed our lives in the last decades. If Christian faith is about bringing the gospel in dialogue with life, if we as the church have the task of reading the signs of the times as the Second Vatican Council has told us to do, and if we can fulfill this task only ecumenically, because as Paul says, is Christ divided? Then we need to do exactly what we are doing today. Reflect on digitization and its spiritual and ethical and political implications, and do it ecumenically. There is no doubt that digitization is a crucial dimension of the signs of the time. In 1641, the French philosopher René Descartes, in his work Meditationes de Prima Philosophia, has created a sentence that has been quoted many times up to this day, and that stands for a whole age, the age of enlightenment. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. If we were looking for a comparable phrase for our age, a proposal which German scholar Gesche Joost has recently made would be a good candidate. I am online, therefore I am. The larger consequences of the enormous impact of this new technology on our lives are discussed controversially. Some see the injustice of opportunities and resources growing rapidly by digitization. Others praise the possibilities of the talented young woman from the Philippines to ad hoc design T-shirts for the company in Kansas, earn a good salary, and develop her abilities without ever having set a foot on US territory. Some rejoice at the medical potential that promises to individuals treatment and healing according to their unique DNA. Others see a second-class medical system coming that will only allow a few rich people to enjoy and also afford top medical treatment. Some happily expect a development of artificial intelligence that does not just cover self-learning systems, but sooner or later the switch to a consciousness that will be superior to human beings. Others ask the concerned question about where AI development is actually leading and whether we are moving towards a new religion of dataism with extended awareness. That's what Yuval Noah Harari says. And our classical picture of humankind doomed. We in the churches are in the thick of these discussions about what may come. Some even see digitization as the fulfillment of a biblical vision. You can certainly sense a little of the Pentecostal spirit blowing in the new possibilities of the digital world and its non-hierarchical communication model of all to all. It did seem to me like a communication miracle when I sat with some young students in the Ecumenical Institute at Bosse some years ago, and a young Georgian woman showed me her translation app with which I could simultaneously read what she said in Georgian in my own German language. Yet there are some differences between the Pentecostal language miracle and this digital miracle of language. The algorithms which govern so much of the digital world, and we've heard about it already this morning, are not God-made, but human-made. What appears in the digital arena does not come like fate out of nowhere. It is guided and controlled. Those responsible for this change have a phone number and an email account. Therefore, what happens in and with the digital world needs to be subject to conscious human agency. This is why it is so important that we come together today to seek and find orientation to this human agency. My first point, justice for all, the option for the poor as a basis for reading the signs of the times. This biblical option for the poor has become the key phrase for a characteristic of both the Old and the New Testament, which has meanwhile gained wide consensus in the churches all over the world. No ideological distortion of the biblical witness has ever been able to extinguish this key feature of the Bible, so prominent in its various layers. We must only recall the notion of human being as the image of God, as a source of equality, or the astonishing fact that the very founding story of God's people is the story of liberation from slavery. We may simply look at the specific character of the law of the Torah as protecting the weak and the marginalized, or listen to the prophets' passionate critique of a religious cult which ignores the struggle for justice. We only have to take account Jesus' understanding of his mission as proclaiming the gospel to the poor, his critique of wealth detached from the needs of the community, and his radical identification with the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the strangers, and the sick. We must simply make an effort to understand the deep social, ethical implications of a God whose incarnation on earth ends as a victim of torture. And we may only seriously reflect Paul's reflection on the cross as a key for God's action in the world. If we reflect all this, we cannot but understand that care for the situation of the poor and disadvantaged, and every possible effort to remove the obstacles which prevent them from improving their situation, is not a special interest of some politically biased Christians influenced by radical theologians, but a central characteristic of the Christian understanding of God and of Christian life in its personal and political dimension. This fundamental perspective on life must also shape our view when we read the signs of the times in terms of the question we are discussing today. the digital age. If the biblical option for the poor shapes our perception of reality, it directs our attention to the divides in the global phase of digitization. As Henrik Simojoki has noted, the discussions on global digital transformation are often characterized by sweeping generalizations. We speak of the digital world, or global digital transformation, or the net generation, or the often used word digital natives. Such generalizations suggest that participation in these digital developments is more or less general. The reality is that access is highly divided. Drawing on recent research, Simojoki describes 8 forms of digital divide: the income divide, the geographic divide, the ethnic divide, the education divide, the gender divide, the age divide, the technological divide, and the global divide. Usage of the internet is highly different in numbers between different parts of the world. While the number of individuals using the internet is high in the so-called developed countries, it is, according to World Bank statistic, relatively low in most so-called less developed countries. In Eritrea, to just give you one pretty extreme example, only 1.2% of the population use the internet, while the number in Germany, for example, is 88.1. This digital divide has different dimensions. Of course, there is a simple dimension of material resources. Who has the money to buy a smartphone or even a tablet or a laptop? How can people pay for the data volume they need to use their smartphone? In Uganda, people spend about 15% in average of their monthly income for 1 gigabyte of data volume. Popular services like Facebook, YouTube, or WhatsApp turn in their cost increased by taxes into a luxury good for the poor. There is a gender gap. In Rwanda, after all, the country with the highest percentage of women in parliament globally, 60% more men have access to the internet than women. There is a gap between cities and rural areas. In the less developed regions, it amounts to about 80%. In Tanzania, for example, it's 84%. In the last years, we have seen a shift from the causes for the global divide. While in former times, the problem was primarily the lack of digital infrastructure, this infrastructure has been developed more and more globally. This progress, however, has not diminished but even increased the inequality even more. Because while some can use this infrastructure and participate in internet communication, others, often the majority, are excluded. Participation is therefore not strengthened but even weakened, a phenomenon which the think tank Research ICT Africa calls the paradox of digital inequality on the African continent. The consequences of these divides for the distribution of global attention, with all its effects on what it is perceived as important or less important, are fundamental. Henryk Simojoki describes the selectivity of perception with the example of the terrorist attack on the French journal Charlie Hebdo on January 7, 2015. Hashtag Je suis Charlie became one of the most popular hashtags in the history of Twitter. Within 24 hours, more than 3.5 million people expressed their solidarity through this hashtag. And this can, of course, only be welcomed. But 2 days later, 2,000 people were massacred in Nigeria by Boko Haram. It was an act of incredible cruelty. However, it did not evoke an outcry in any way comparable to the one 2 days before. Let me make the theme of digital divide and strategies against it more concrete by introducing a school networking project, which came out of the 500th anniversary celebration of Reformation, and which has developed into a success in global digital inclusion. Henryk Simojoki, who together with Annette Scheuenpflug has been one of the initiators and promoters, uses it as a live world basis of his scholarly article on digital divide. The project, by the name Schools 500 Reformation, with the internet platform schools500reformation.net, aimed at connecting Protestant schools worldwide by digitally bringing together teachers, students, school principals, and administrators in education. The goal was bringing together 500 schools, 500 years, 500 schools. But soon, and I witnessed it, I wasn't sure whether we would reach this number of 500, but very soon it was 660 schools already registered. And the strongest concentration of schools did not come from Europe, but from countries in Central Africa, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Cameroon, and Tanzania. News were being shared, newsletters were being distributed, learning materials was exchanged, an interactive forum was added in which teachers and pupils from the participating schools could interact directly. The digital divide between the global north and south, which the project wanted to bridge, could be illustrated at the beginning by the frequency of school homepages. In Germany, it is standard that every school has a homepage of its own. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, from the more than 100 Protestant schools participating from Congo, only one had a school homepage. The project changed digital participation of the schools considerably. When all schools were asked to send in theses for the future, which teachers collected from students and then published globally, strikingly, the country that sent in the most theses was the Democratic Republic of Congo. During the project, it became clear that digital exchange was not enough. We already heard about that this morning. Therefore, 3 regional conferences took place in Africa, which made face-to-face exchange possible. And in the anniversary year, 80 principals, school principals from Protestant schools from Africa, Asia, Australia, Europe, and Latin and North America came together in Wittenberg to exchange their experiences. I was there, and I will always remember this conference as an experience of the, really sensed experience of the global one Church of Jesus Christ, connected beyond national, social, and cultural borders. Despite this obvious success of the project, Simojoki's conclusion is also conscious of the difficulties. In the so-called digital age, connecting people and bridging distances between the global north and the global south, he says, is still much more complicated and laborious than the popular idea of global connectivity would mislead us into believing. And he also mentioned this necessity of seeing each other in person. But I want to add to the discussion this morning also the dilemma, which I'm in as a church leader. I have turned down invitations now because of climate change, because we need to be very careful in what conferences we attend physically and what not. We cannot simply erase physical meetings. We should not, while the business community is doing it. But we should be very aware of what we are causing by coming together in great numbers. It does not exclude coming together, but it must be one level of consciousness in making these decisions, which makes it complicated to deal with the experience that we have just heard about. The digital divide that we have looked at on the global scale is, of course, also an issue in national societies, even in wealthy countries such as Germany. The last 18 months have exposed this digital divide in national societies, even in the wealthy countries, clearer than ever before. Access to the digital world turned from one among several dimensions of societal participation into the decisive form of societal participation. Lack of participation was therefore detrimental to human souls. This was especially evident for high-age people, not so familiar with digital communication, and therefore often literally isolated from their normal communities. Often enough, what was sorrow at the beginning turned into tragedies in which people were even dying of loneliness. The harsh consequences of digital divide, however, also hit young people in a particular way. During many months, schooling had to completely switch into a digital mode. In addition to the injustices of sharply differing levels of family support in homeschooling during this time, the simple technical equipment sharply differed. In poor families in my country, with several children, these children had to compete about the tablet or laptop if there was one in the family at all. And families, even in my country, who didn't have the digital equipment had to pay a monthly fee for borrowing it, adding to the strains of the daily budget. The consequence of this digital divide during the pandemic will become really visible only in the future. But not much imagination is needed to conclude that the injustice in educational opportunities has been much aggravated during this time. It may be at least mentioned that besides the divide in access to the internet, which we call the digital divide, there's also a discussion on what I would call the digitally caused divide. There's research which suggests that even equal access to the internet causes a divide. Alexander Filipovich, who did that research, cites showing that there is a double spiral effect that increases inequality. Those with good education profit from a sophisticated use of the internet, with the result of deepening their education, upwarding their social position, and strengthening their social capital. That's the spiral upward. While others with low education and a precarious socio-economic starting position do not profit from internet use comparably and are therefore sometimes even more left out. That's the spiral downward. Countering these dynamics of divides is one of the challenges of shaping digitization responsibly. Now, my fourth point is overcoming monopoly structures. Digital justice is endangered by monopoly structures caused by an extremely fast build-up of entrepreneurial power. One always has to really realize how short this period of time was when these companies has grown out of the earth from nothing through these technological developments. Only 2 decades, an extremely short time if you look at the history of economy. Extremely short time. But they have come to an extreme amount of power in this extremely short time. The communication of billions of people is controlled by a handful of those powerful companies. Google's market share has constantly been above 90%, with about 2 trillion yearly searches. Google's next competitor, Bing, only holds 2.5% of market share, while Yahoo even accounts for only 1.5%. Noah Yuval Harari, who has written some books that almost became famous on these questions, has emphasized the power which come from this market position. Since we, and I quote him, since we increasingly use Google when we look for answers, our ability feigns to look for information ourselves. Already today, truth is defined by the top results of the Google search. Another example, the number of Facebook users has constantly increased since 2008. As of the second quarter of 2020, Facebook had about almost 2.9 billion monthly active users. Not people who were registered, monthly active users. Every change, one always has to really realize that. Every change in the Facebook algorithm, and I've experienced it myself using Facebook, every change in the Facebook algorithm has an impact on the communication behavior of billions of people worldwide. One has to really realize that. The growth in usage of AI technologies, to make another point, like machine learning and deep learning, spreads the ability to shift through vast amounts of data and mine them for patterns and trends. Hence, companies who are sitting on a treasure trove of data, of user data, have new capabilities to use and commercialize it. That means big data players become even more powerful. As German theologian Peter Dabrock has noted, large data collectors like digital platforms with a massive user base and enormous amounts of daily traffic can merge various silos of data and create new products and services with a clear advantage compared to small startup businesses that have yet to collect data from a far smaller user base. This creates a winner takes it all logic, and makes it much harder for startups to join once a strong incumbent has established itself. The long-term effects, according to Darbock, are significant, and I quote him, "Since this logic rewards great size, we are experiencing a situation of monopolization which has never existed before in the history of economics," unquote. For the famous global investor, George Soros, the Hungarian, who often is in the news media because of his activities, but also because of his tension with his Hungarian homeland. For George Soros, Google and Facebook are monopolists who cultivate addiction, menace independent thinking, and make a state-financed surveillance of their citizens possible for dictators. How to counter such monopoly tendencies is an important topic of ethically reflecting on digital justice, and we've already discussed it a little bit this morning. My fifth point, making algorithms responsible, re-establishing democratic discourse logic in digital communication. And we have already spoken a little bit about this in Ellen Ueberschär's presentation, but I want to deepen this. Besides these monopoly structures that I've talked about in the digital economy, there is this other danger for liberty and justice as they are so crucial for pluralistic democracies. The commercial logic of the digital economy and its powerful effect on personal and public communication threatens the very fabric of discourse, so crucial for democratic societies. The fact that the internet is full of fake news and hate speech, full of conspiracy theories and extremist content, is no coincidence. It has a reason. And we need to address this reason for populist movements, many other phenomena that we deplore. We need to address these reasons much more than we have so far, and they have to do with the question we're discussing today, the digital age. Studies say, and it was already mentioned, that through their recommendations and algorithms, platforms like YouTube quickly attract users towards extreme, more extreme, even extremist content. The platforms don't assess the political content. They do not create their algorithms according to truth criteria or according to certain fundamental values, but simply according to the potential advertisement-based money output. If more extreme contents generate the highest financial revenue, and that is the case, deplorably, the algorithms will push them, no matter how detrimental they might be for democratic culture or the promotion of human dignity. And when I say the algorithms push them, I mean that those contents come onto your screen much more than other contents. So it is decisive what these algorithms are doing. It is, if this is true, then if algorithms really work like this, then platforms like YouTube or Facebook are the most powerful instruments in the 21st century for turning people into extremists. The fatal alliance of the extremist attitudes of some users and economic interests of the platforms is endangering our democracies. Not the exchange of arguments is the driving force, but the logic of consumer preference. Algorithms, I say it again, serve profit interests, not the pursuit of the common good. The consumer logic of pleasing and nudging the recipient becomes the paradigm for communication. Mutual affirmation in opinion building, in filter bubbles, overtakes the sometimes quite unpleasant exchange of controversial arguments. Jaron Lanier, one of the pioneers of the digital revolution, somebody who has developed these things, who comes from within, recommends leaving the commercial-driven social networks altogether and proposes moving towards social networks which are not financed through commercials, but through subscription fees. For him, this is the only way to prevent, and that's the expression he uses, to prevent a culture of consumer idiots formed solely by commerce-driven communication culture. I want to add another proposal that comes more from the European context, even from the German context. That was proposed by former CEO of the German public TV station, the ARD, Ulrich Wilhelm. He envisions an internationally publicly funded internet platform responsible not to shareholders, but to the public, expecting not a certain financial output, but being responsible to commonly shared basic values, such as the inviolability of human dignity. And to just make sure that it's not misunderstood, it's not a state TV. It's a pluralistically oversighted TV or a social network. Such possibility would be an alternative to commercially driven internet platforms ignoring such basic moral values. And I come to my conclusion. When we theologically reflect upon the Christian view on digital justice, two aspects must play a central role, which are intrinsically connected: relationality and vulnerability. What it means to be a human being can only be understood for us as Christians if we interpret it from the humanity of Jesus. And Karl Barth, the famous Protestant theologian, says, whoever does not know and take into account from the very first place and from the very first view and word that the human being has a fellow human being does not see him or her at all. It is decisive for theological anthropology to understand how specific this Christological foundation is. It does not suffice just to speak of some general humanity with some general relationality. Such humanity and such relationality are qualified. Jesus is the vulnerable human being, the tortured human being, the powerless, abused human being. Relationality, theologically understood, is therefore always relationality from below. That will have to be the starting point when we reflect upon this sentence, which will hopefully reach our hearts and minds as the motto on our way to the Karlsruhe Assembly a year from now. Christ's love moves the world to reconciliation and unity. Our divided world needs our contribution as Christians. It needs our public witness, and that's why this sentence for me is a true sentence of hope. Christ's love moves the world to reconciliation and unity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Heinrich Bedford-Strohm, for your presentation. From the perspective of a male bishop, from a generation with a lot of experience, and from the German context. I would like to invite you participants at home maybe to stand up from your chair, to stretch your arms and your legs in the meantime, and to gain more and again more energy. And then come back to your desk, to your computers, and ask questions and contribute comments in the chat. Your questions will be brought forward in the discussion after we will be have been hearing 2 reactions to the first 2 keynotes. Now our attention turns to Dr. Erin Green. Dr. Erin Green is a researcher and activist working in the area of artificial intelligence, democracy, and the militarization of digital technologies. Erin is an interdisciplinary scientist who developed a novel approach to historical, ecological, and social impacts of artificial intelligence and robots. Erin, I welcome you here. Please take the pulpit. We are very happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much. I realize that my biography made me sound really quite so serious. I'm very glad to be here and to be with you, and especially to our friends online. I know there are so many things demanding your digital attention, and it's really a gift to all of us that you've chosen to spend time with us together today. So thank you for that. I'm appreciative of that. And also thank you to our keynotes this morning for starting our discussion off in such an incredible way and such a rich way, and for bringing up many of the things that I think I otherwise will put into different words in my reflections. In Bishop Bedford-Strohm's speech, I was particularly grateful for the opportunity to reflect on divides in the plural. I think that this gives an important nuance and complexity to our conversations about social justice in a digital age and about digital justice in society. And I think that's incredibly important to hold on to as we continue our reflection throughout this symposium and beyond. I think we can never lose sight that digital justice will also require at once gender justice, climate justice, economic justice, racial justice, and so much more. So let's go deeper and continue making these connections. So I also come from a theological perspective, but my remarks are grounded in my obsession with artificial intelligence. So you will hear some things repeated in a different way and expanding upon some of the ideas that we've already heard. So in my studying of artificial intelligence, I've been continually struck by how new it really isn't. Of course, many of the technologies that we see seem like a radical break in history. We talk a lot in terms of revolution, of technology, inbreaking and creating something totally unprecedented in history. And of course, there are plenty of people who would argue for that. I would instead counsel that it is much wiser to look for continuities. Because in doing so, we don't see an uncharted landscape before us. We don't see this fearful unknown. What we see instead is questions and wisdom of our ancestors already embedded in our communities that we can draw on to these new digital questions. When we turn to questions about digital justice, we find in the Christian tradition actually an incredible depth of insight and resources on topics like racial justice, gender justice, ecological justice, economic justice, and so on, so that we can bring these insights to digital questions which are intimately connected. So instead of fearing that we don't know enough about the digital, we can weigh in as experts and reframe our understanding of expertise and go confidently, knowing that we in fact have an incredible wealth to offer about what it means to be human and what it means to live justly within the web of creation. My second point turns to my original and core motivation for studying artificial intelligence. That is military investment and interest in artificial intelligence. And so far this morning, we've come close to it, but we've not discussed it explicitly. So when we look at things like drones in surveillance, when we look to things like the so-called arms race between the United States and China in artificial intelligence, when we look at Google's activity in buying up artificial intelligence and robotics companies that were largely funded through defense agencies, we can see just the tip of the iceberg of military investment and momentum behind artificial intelligence and related technologies. So it is not enough within our context to simply look at these technologies, how they are used, and how we receive them in community. We in fact need to go a few steps back, right to the source, and look at who is funding these, on what agendas, and how the research methodologies are being propelled forward. So who is choosing the questions we will answer, and who is choosing the problems that we will solve? When we were hearing this morning, for example, about the credit rating system and how that is problematic in so many contexts, the idea is not so much that we just simply need to fix the system, but to question whether the system should exist at all. To illustrate further the extent of military interest in digital technology, specifically artificial intelligence, 1 out of every 4 countries on this planet has a declared investment in developing military robotics, and that is only the declared. Of course, there will be much covert and hidden in classified military agendas. And cumulative global defense spending on artificial intelligence is expected to be around $487 billion in the coming decade. So to imagine that, that's a 500 followed by 9 more zeros. In this regard, the world is very much at a tipping point. While churches and church organizations are already positioning themselves as allies in the effort to demilitarize AI and digital technologies, we need to do so much more. And this comes, I think, in 2 primary forms. The first is through grassroots efforts and mobilizations. The organization I work for, Pax Christi International, is a Catholic peace organization. And one of our projects in the Great Lakes region of Central Africa is to support our partners as they develop digital incubators for young people. And what I love about these projects is that young folks are not only just learning how to use the technologies and apply them to peace building and nonviolence, but they are also setting the agenda themselves. They decide for themselves in their communities what are the problems they want to solve, what are the issues they want to address. And so I think these grassroots contributions are central to a just response to these digital technologies. This must be paired with, however, full, energetic theological debate, communal discernment in symposia and in fora like this, and really active participation in civil society with organizations and actors that have a skill set that goes beyond what churches and church organizations can offer. And I think you can see this really wonderfully exemplified as the world looks towards the development of an international treaty on the banning of lethal autonomous weapon systems. Church organizations and churches have been instrumental in fueling that and will continue to be instrumental both as the world moves towards the treaty and as we look towards its implementation. My final point, when we learn about the social and ecological impact about artificial intelligence, what I have really seen is that it fundamentally acts as an accelerant or an amplifier to things that are already present within our societies and cultures. Certainly, as we have heard this morning, algorithmic bias is just systemic racism or systemic misogyny or systemic homophobia by another name. Similarly, we can see how greed, unsustainable consumption, imperialism all find their way through artificial intelligence from the very questions we bring to the table. the research structures, methodologies, and finally the outcomes are all imbued with these very human and very damaging patterns. I was recently reading about the Maori efforts to preserve and promote their indigenous language using speech-to-text technologies. They became embattled in a struggle against the platform providers over ownership of their data, ownership of their language, and who would profit from the harvesting of it. Similarly, we can see the African continent is increasingly a testing field for these technologies. And specifically, when we think in terms of artificial intelligence, this includes facial recognition. The Zimbabwean government, for instance, recently signed partnership agreements with a Chinese startup that would see the tremendous expansion of facial recognition data sets. So are these movements new opportunities for those who have previously been excluded from digitalization? Or is this just colonialism in another form? So when we look to questions of digital justice, take heart that theological reasoning, church organizations, civil society partners are already ready for the debates that we now find around us. We need to go forward as experts, humbly, but ones in need of expanding connection and global community with civil society and other partners. Here, we can start to tip the balance away from digital injustice and toward the already not yet flourishing of all beings that is promised to us in the reign of God. And I thank you again for your attention.
Thank you very much, Erin, for your response to Heinrich Bedford-Strohm and your additions, your own views and expertise. Let's hear one more positioning before we will come to your questions in the chat. I am pleased to introduce to you Dr. Sarah Macharia. Sarah is Program Manager for Media and Gender Justice at the World Association for Christian Communication. She holds a PhD in political science and has worked extensively with feminist movements worldwide. She coordinates an initiative for gender equality in and through news media. We look forward to your contribution in your digital contribution, your real present contribution in a digital room, because, yes, here you are.
Thank you, Christina. And thank you to the World Council of Churches and the World Association for Christian Communication and all the co-organizers for bringing us this timely symposium. And thank you, Bishop Strohm, for the critical discussion. I will be speaking from the perspective, from a feminist perspective, from a gender justice perspective. Now, the gender justice community is aware of the opportunities presented by digitalization, but it is also very sharply attuned to the injustices resulting from this process and those that are intrinsic to the current digital media sphere. Consider this excerpt from the outcomes of the 57th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. The Commission is an annual meeting of the global intergovernmental body dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women. It meets every March in New York. Now, this is what it reads, and bear with me, it's a little long, but do pay attention to these lists. The excerpt reads, support the development and use of ICT and social media as a resource for the empowerment of women and girls, including access to information on the prevention of and response to violence against women and girls, and develop mechanisms to combat the use of ICT and social media to perpetrate violence against women and girls, including the criminal misuse of ICTs for sexual harassment, sexual exploitation, child pornography, and trafficking in women and girls, and emerging forms of violence such as cyberstalking, cyberbullying, and privacy violations that compromise women's and girls' safety. This was a recommendation that was made by the Commission in 2013, that is more than almost a decade ago. The two opportunities that are mentioned in this excerpt and a longer list of challenges convey in a nutshell the realities of digitalization for women and girls. I will highlight 3 issues that gender justice communities are concerned about. The first
Sarah,
issue,
can you hear me?
yes, I can hear you.
Could you take a minute, please, to have a little bit more distance to your microphone? Because we hear a lot of second noises, and that hinders a bit to concentrate on your very important words. Can you?
Is this a little bit better?
It's a little bit better. It could be a bit more distant.
Is this better?
Yeah. And the interpreters would like to ask you whether you could slow down a little bit. We have time.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, certainly. Just before this, I read out an excerpt of a recommendation from the Commission on the Status of Women. So I will highlight 3 issues that gender justice communities are concerned about. The first issue is divided access. A woman who is poor, who is racialized or of ethnic minority origin, who is elderly and resident in a rural area of a global South nation is on the wrong side of all of Simoyoki's 8 digital divides. If women's equal participation in all domains of life depends on their communication rights, including their right to access and use digital technologies, they have a wider gap to bridge because of the gender power inequalities characteristic of all societies, some more intense than others. The second issue that we are concerned about is the biased algorithms. The bishop rightly noted that algorithms which govern so much of the digital world are not God-made, but human-made. What appears in the digital arena does not come like fate out of nowhere. It is guided and controlled. The growth in usage of AI technologies like machine learning and deep learning spreads the ability to shift through various amounts of data and mine them for patterns and trends. Now, these technologies have been called out for their inbuilt racial and gender biases. Just earlier this month, Facebook apologized after AI labeled a video of Black men as primates. To quote a New York Times article, Google, Amazon, and other technology companies have been under scrutiny for years for biases within their artificial intelligence systems, particularly around issues of race. Studies have shown that facial recognition is biased against people of color and has more trouble identifying them, leading to incidents where Black people have been discriminated against or arrested because of computer error. This is an article in the New York Times on the 3rd of September this year. Yet, these companies have large repositories of images they could use to train their image recognition algorithms. And the bishop talked about the vast amount of resources that they have. Internet search engines and software companies are not the sole culprits. Institutions that use AI technology are sometimes part of the problem. I remember one time sitting in a UN plenary session and reading the translations of speeches scrolling on the overhead screen for a good number of brown and Black speakers addressing the session in UN designated languages. The scrolling text read the words undecipherable throughout a good portion of their speeches. This is a monumental failing to train AI to treat all voices equally. And then finally, online gender-based violence. Increased digitalization, as it currently plays out, comes with greater exposure of girls and women to sexualized harassment, surveillance, trolling, and online hate, all of which can and do spill out from the virtual world into the physical lived world. Abuse may be confined to networked technologies or may be supplemented with offline harassment, including vandalism, phone calls, and physical assault. This is an observation that was made by the Broadband Commission for Digital Development 5 years ago, and it's still rampant. Violence against women is a key obstacle for women's human rights. It was first defined in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or the CEDAW, in 1979. But now we have a more holistic perspective that recognizes various types and modalities of violence against women and girls. Digitalization has exacerbated existing violence and introduced new forms. The Broadband Commission says almost 3/4 of women have been exposed to some form of violence online. To quote feminist communication scholars, for many women, the internet represents a public open space into which they can escape, where they can exist beyond persecution and in which they can feel empowered to express and build friendships. The emancipatory gain that the internet provides are, however, severely curtailed by acts of gender-based violence perpetrated online. Disregard for privacy sometimes means intensifying women's vulnerability to violence. The scholars say, and these are Gurumurthy, Vasudevan, and Chami from India, for women who wish to conceal their gender online, or for sexual minorities who are persecuted in the country in which they reside, the lack of anonymity can leave them vulnerable. In countries such as Mexico, cyber violence has been at the core of public debates in recent years. In January this year, the government of Mexico City published an executive order referred to as Olympia Act to revise the criminal code for Mexico City and the law of women's access to a violence-free life in Mexico City. During this pandemic lockdown period, those who have taken part in virtual events related to feminist work, to gender equality work, have been confronted by trolls and hackers who hijack our screens, people who pose as legitimate attendees or succeed to bypass security protocols. The impact of online violence is the silencing of women who are forced to disengage from the digital space or to confine themselves to hidden corners of the internet. While being online is essential for work, it's essential for health and community, particularly now when we have extended periods of isolation due to COVID-19. The bishop remarked that others question where AI development is actually leading. The direction and nature of evolution left unchanged, AI development will likely lead to a world where social prejudice, racism, sexism, and misogyny reign. One only needs to analyze the experiences of women in the industry and throughout its output to conclude that the processes are not value-free, the technologies are not value-free. They are infused with the values of those who create them. We've seen, like, for example, in Africa, funding to support innovation is not pegged to addressing these intersecting injustices. There seems to be an assumption to funders that just supporting innovation without making a deliberate effort to address these issues is sufficient. So what can we do about it? And I will end here. The bishop cited Yaron Lani's recommendation for social networks not financed through commercials, but through subscription fees, and Ulrich Wilhelm's proposal for an international publicly funded internet platform responsible to commonly shared basic values. So how about holding the existing platforms accountable? Gender justice advocates underline the need to actively make use of complaints mechanisms identified in social media community standards pages and those provided by regulatory bodies. We encourage pro-action in calling for private sector accountability to human rights, including women's human rights. A critical mass of faith communities can help shape digital transformation in a direction that works for everyone, regardless of color, creed, gender, and all the other markers of social identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for this, for your important words and remarks. In the chat on YouTube, on Zoom, you have sent us questions. Most of the questions are about the algorithms and discourse. Let me read one first question to you. In former decades, we debated hotly that misinformation by certain newspapers with high distribution that strongly influenced public opinion and politics. Today, we criticize algorithms for influencing. What is the difference if it comes to public opinion? Is this the despair of intellectuals about not being heard? Yes.
Well, it's an interesting thesis, but I must say I think that it's more than the despair of the intellectual. Because, of course, we already had misinformation before. Of course, we had boulevard newspapers that were creating hate and prejudice. But I think it has a new quality with the digital world now. And one important part of this new quality is the lack of really identifiable responsibility. Algorithms are anonymous, and the mechanisms work in a way that we normally cannot really follow. If, for example, I won't call a certain name, but if a big boulevard newspaper in my own country publishes a certain article, I can identify who wrote it. Normally, it's written in the newspaper. And if the name is not there, I can hold responsible the chairman of the journalists who publishes this newspaper, and I can discuss this individual case. What we are now experiencing is the systematic effort of misinforming people. I say it again, generated by algorithms. Let me give an example. There's a city in northern Macedonia that basically lives from the profits of misinforming. And the incentive that creates or that makes people do this is not misinforming people. Maybe the people who ask them to do it might have that incentive or that intention. But their incentive is simply the question, what do I have to send into the internet in order to generate clicks or durance of staying on that homepage? And that's what they want to create in order to create profit from advertisement time. So they invent news. Just to give you one example, the earth is flat, not a ball, not round, but is flat. There's an internet video, a YouTube video, that gives this message and explains it. That video, one has studied this phenomenon, that video gets 5 or 6 times more clicks or durance than a video that tells the truth. Everybody knows that it's fake, that it's stupid. Most people know. But this internet video gets more clicks. And that's the danger. That's the problem. That whatever the reason is, maybe we are fascinated by the stupidness. Whatever the reason is, we stay on that video. And this is a different dimension of systematically misleading people or creating hate than we have experienced it so far in the non-digital newspaper world.
Thank you, Heinrich. We have about 5 more minutes for 2 very important questions. Okay. The first is, do you see any positive aspects of algorithms? Could we turn them around to a positive use? Could we turn our own perspective around?
Yes, I've tried to say that I do not see digitalization as something evil, not at all. I have maybe emphasized that more because that's what we have to deal with. But there's a lot of great possibilities of the digital world, so we should neither condemn it nor enthusiastically celebrate it. We should responsibly shape it, digitalization. That's what we should do. And that means that, of course, we should use also algorithms, but now comes the decisive point. Algorithms have to be made responsible to the public in the best case. We need to know what we're doing, and for example, the developers of algorithms, the programmers, they need to develop an ethic of algorithms, a professional ethic of algorithms. There are already projects funded by foundations that are trying to do that. A professional ethics of algorithm programmers. That's, for example, one simple piece. And then the second big point, and that has to be done, we are not that far yet. We need to even understand algorithms and the working of algorithms. It cannot be that there is a point where almost nobody even understands anymore what algorithms do. And that is a real danger for a culture of responsibility that we as churches, of course, need to promote. So the biggest step is really to discuss it in civil society, to include those people in the communities of those companies who have the professional knowledge into this ethical discourse. Just to mention the military aspect that you have very importantly described, one of the things that gave hope to me was that there was an initiative of people who worked with Google who were simply denying the order to work on a contract with a military complex. The Google co-worker said, "We are not doing this." And the result was that the company had to cancel the contract. This is just one example, but that's the path to go.
Last question. Who has the money, you ask in the first part of your presentation. How can we understand the digital divide as a consequence of the century-old colonization and exploitation? What kind of role would a country like Germany or a church like the Bavarian Church must play if we agree with this assumption? Or do you not agree?
Well, yes, I do agree. And I think that the colonization is still one of the blind spots of our cultural memory in Germany, of our historical memory. We have a very developed memory culture, and I praise that. I praise the fact that I was raised in my family and at school with hearing much about the Holocaust, and that shaped my own involvement very much, because I'm saying this should never happen again. And the human dignity, if that is violated, then we must speak up as churches. So I treasure that memory, but we have to complete it. We have to extend our cultural memory, also the memory of the injustice that we as a country have caused. And of course, colonization is part of that. Maybe one of the most touching experiences in my relations to South Africa is when my friend Thabo Makgoba, the Archbishop of Cape Town, when he wrote a book, and we talked about it too, where he describes how the skull of his great-grandfather, who was massacred and beheaded by the colonists, how a German colonist drank whiskey out of that skull at special occasions. It's almost so, you almost cannot even talk about it. But he allowed me to talk about it. And that skull possibly was brought to Germany. And for him, it's very important to understand where is this skull? What happened to the skull of his great-grandfather? And to be confronted with the consequence in such a personal way, the consequence of the colonial heritage, that touched me very much, and I wrote about it also in a big column. And for me, that was one example for how we still have blind eyes for a lot of our colonial injustice history as a country. So I think, of course, the digital gap is, of course, also caused through the injustices, inequalities that were caused through colonization. So there is a connection, which is why we have to feel the responsibility of overcoming it, which is why we're together today.
Thank you very much for answering the questions of our participants, for being here, all three of you in this session. Thank you for being with us. And all of you participants at the screens on your computers and laptops, you are owing a break now. We have a break now, and we see each other again at 14 o'clock, 2 o'clock Berlin time, and please rest and see you again at 2 o'clock.